They scanned the highest mountains on the planet and called it an empty fortress, waiting to be claimed. No cities up there, no roads, no organized defense for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. Just rock, ice, thin air, and a handful of villages that didn't even show up clearly on their sensors. What their scan did not detect, what no orbital survey in directorate history had ever properly accounted for, was that the emptiest ground on Earth already belonged to something. Something that had been hunting those slopes since long before either species had a word for invasion. By the end of tonight, you're going to find out exactly what happens when a fleet lands in the territory of an apex predator that never once agreed to share it. If you like watching overconfident empires get humbled by nature itself, smash that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me the highest place you've ever stood, because trust me, it's not going to beat this one. Let's get into it. 400 light-years from Earth, aboard a command vessel shaped like a curved obsidian wedge, the Threshold Fleet Survey Division finished its analysis of a mountain range that had, for weeks, sat quietly near the top of every conquest priority list the fleet's analysts could generate. High Commander Voss studied the report with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 3 centuries learning to recognize an easy target when the numbers agreed with him. "Explain the appeal," he said to his intelligence officer, a narrow, methodical soldier named Ket who prided himself on never presenting a recommendation he hadn't triple-checked. "Elevation extreme," Ket said. "Population density near zero across the majority of the range. Detected infrastructure, minimal, scattered villages with no organized military presence for hundreds of kilometers. No air defense grid covers this region. No rapid response capability exists at this altitude. By every metric our doctrine uses to identify a secure staging ground, Commander, this is the safest landing zone on the entire planet." And the terrain itself? Ket checked the secondary data. "Steep, Commander, but our units are rated for vertical assault across a range of hostile surfaces. Elevation-related atmospheric thinning is noted but classified as a minor operational concern, manageable with standard rebreather equipment." Voss nodded, satisfied. He had conquered the spire cities of a world called Threnody, built on cliffs that made these mountains look gentle by comparison. He had led assaults through terrain that would have killed lesser commanders through sheer vertical exhaustion alone. Rock was rock. Altitude was altitude. His forces had trained for worse. What the scan had not detected, because no orbital sensor array in Threshold Fleet history had ever been calibrated to look for it, was that this particular stretch of empty, indifferent stone was not actually empty at all. It was home. It had been home for longer than either species involved in tonight's events could properly reckon, to something that did not appear on population scans, because it did not build structures, did not generate heat signatures worth flagging, and had never once needed permission from anyone to consider these slopes its own. "Deploy the 3rd Assault Wing," Voss said. "Establish a forward staging position along the high ridgeline. If the terrain proves as undefended as projected, we use this range as a base for operations across the entire subcontinent." The village of Chundrathang sat at just over 4,000 meters, a scattering of stone houses tucked into a fold of the mountains, where the wind cut a little less viciously than it did on the open slopes above. It was small even by the standards of the high valleys, 40-some households, a school that doubled as the only building with reliable electricity, and a single unpaved road that connected it to the rest of the world for about 7 months of the year, weather depending. Namgyal Dorje had lived there his whole life, 61 years of it, most of them spent as the village's informal guide tracker, and for the last decade, its most dedicated snow leopard researcher, a role he'd more or less invented himself after a conservation group had come through years ago and left behind a handful of camera traps and a promise of funding that arrived, at best, irregularly. He knew every ridge within 20 kilometers the way another man might know the streets of his own hometown. And he knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how many pairs of eyes were watching those ridges at any given moment, even when the mountain looked entirely still. His granddaughter, Tenzin, 24 and home for the season after finishing her wildlife biology degree in Delhi, had spent the last 3 weeks helping him check the camera traps scattered across the upper slopes, a task that mostly involved long, cold hikes and the occasional thrill of finding a genuinely good photograph of an animal that preferred, above almost anything else, not to be photographed at all. That evening, the two of them were sitting on the low wall outside the house, drinking butter tea and reviewing the day's camera footage on a battered laptop, when the light came down out of a sky that had been perfectly clear an hour before. It didn't streak like a meteor. It didn't tumble. It came down in a slow, deliberate arc, correcting itself against a crosswind in a way nothing natural bothered to do, and settled onto a wide, flat shoulder of rock about 6 kilometers up valley, well above the tree line, in terrain that even Namgyal, who had walked most of these slopes at one point or another, considered genuinely difficult ground. Tenzin lowered her tea slowly. "Grandfather, did you see that?" "I saw it." Namgyal was already standing, already looking toward the dark shape of the ridge where the light had gone down, with the particular stillness of a man doing rapid, careful math about weather, terrain, and exactly how much daylight was left. "That is not a plane. It's not a satellite either. Satellites don't slow down." "No," Namgyal agreed, "they don't." 6 kilometers up the valley, on a wind-scoured shelf of rock at just over 5,000 meters, the hatch on the newly landed vessel hissed open into air that immediately did something none of its occupants had experienced across 11 previously conquered worlds. It thinned. Scout Leader Ravik of the Threshold Fleet's 3rd Assault Wing stepped down the ramp in a rebreather unit rated, according to the specification sheet, for the harshest atmospheric conditions in Directorate cataloging. That sheet had been written by engineers working from atmospheric density charts pulled from an orbital scan, none of whom had ever personally tried to breathe at 5,000 meters while wearing 40 kilograms of combat plating. Within 3 minutes, 2 of his 6 scouts had their rebreathers throwing warnings about oxygen saturation that the translator rendered in tones considerably more alarmed than the equipment's usual diagnostic language. "Report," Ravik said, his own breath coming shorter than he cared to admit. "Commander, atmospheric density at this elevation is significantly below projected parameters. Rebreather units are compensating, but efficiency is degraded." The scan rated this terrain as manageable with standard equipment. The scan rated the terrain, Commander. It did not fully account for elevation this extreme relative to sea level. Several of us are experiencing what the medical database is calling early-stage hypoxia. Ravik looked out across the ridge, at jagged white peaks stacked against a sky gone a deep, hard blue in the fading light, at a landscape so still and so vast it seemed almost to be waiting for something. Somewhere out there, in the thinning dark, something was already watching his formation with far more patience than his own scouts currently had breath to spare. "Establish a defensive perimeter," Ravik said. "Slow movements only. Conserve oxygen." What he did not know, what no scan from orbit could have told him, was that a perimeter meant very little to something that had never once needed to be seen in order to hunt. Above the landing site, on a rock outcrop that offered a clear view down onto the shelf without offering any clear view back, an adult male snow leopard had been lying motionless for the better part of 20 minutes, watching the strange, bright, noisy arrival with the flat, patient attention of an animal that had survived 11 winters at altitudes that killed most things that tried to compete with it. Local biologists, in the handful of papers that had ever been written about this particular individual, called him Male 12, a designation pulled from a camera trap database that Tenzin herself had helped compile. The herders in Chundrathang, who had occasionally lost a goat to him over the years and bore him no particular grudge for it, simply called him the Old Ghost, because that was, more or less, what a snow leopard was to anyone who lived among them. A shape you almost never saw directly, a set of tracks in fresh snow, a sound at the edge of hearing that made the dogs go quiet. Snow leopards did not, as a rule, investigate loud, bright, unfamiliar things immediately. They were ambush predators, built around patience rather than confrontation, and every instinct that had kept this particular animal alive through 11 brutal winters told him to watch first, to understand the shape and the rhythm of a new thing on his mountain before deciding what, if anything, needed to be done about it. So he watched. He watched the strange, upright shapes moving stiffly across the rock, breathing hard in a way that, to a predator finely tuned to reading exhaustion and vulnerability in prey animals at altitude, was almost impossible to ignore. He watched them struggle to establish a perimeter. On ground he had crossed 1,000 times without effort, and somewhere in the old, patient calculus that governed every decision a snow leopard made on these slopes, a very simple conclusion began to form. These things were slow. These things were struggling. These things were, by every measure that mattered to a hunter who had survived here longer than almost anything else on the mountain, exactly the kind of opportunity worth investigating further. Namgyal and Tenzin reached the edge of their own safe judgment about an hour after the sighting, standing at the highest point above the village that still offered a clear line toward the landing site. Binoculars trained on lights that flickered against the dark ridge like something out of a story neither of them had ever expected to need to believe. "We should call someone," Tenzin said. "Call who? There is no signal past the school building, and even there it comes and goes with the wind." "The district office, then, in the morning." Namgyal lowered the binoculars slowly, the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades reading this mountain settling over him. "In the morning, we will call whoever will listen. Tonight, there is nothing to do but watch and stay well back and let the mountain do what the mountain does." "What does that mean?" Namgyal looked toward the ridge, toward the shapes moving carefully across ground he knew as well as his own hands, and toward the particular quality of stillness in the rocks just above the landing site that told him, more clearly than any camera trap ever had, exactly what kind of attention those shapes had already attracted. "It means," he said, "that whatever those lights are, they have landed in Male 12's territory, and Male 12 does not care what a thing is made of. He only cares whether it moves like something worth watching." It was Private Senek, youngest of Ravik's scouts and the one whose rebreather had begun throwing the most persistent warnings, who first noticed the disturbance among the rocks above the perimeter, a shifting of shadow that his suit's motion sensors flagged and then, a half-second later, unflagged, as though the sensor itself had decided the reading didn't make sense and simply chosen to disregard it. "Commander," Senek said, voice thin with the effort of speaking at this elevation, "sensor is showing intermittent movement to the nor-northeast. Elevated position." "Wildlife," Ravik said, checking his own display. The scan flagged several large mammal signatures in this region prior to landing. Low threat classification. The classification lists them as felines, Commander. Solitary. Low aggression toward unfamiliar targets. "Then it is nothing," Ravik said, though something in the way his own breath had gone shallow made the reassurance sound less confident than he intended. The classification, drawn from a general zoological database compiled centuries earlier from a handful of distant observations, had never been updated with the specific, patient, ambush-driven behavioral profile of an apex predator, evaluating a struggling, oxygen-starved group of intruders on its own home ground. It had certainly never been updated with anything resembling accurate information on how that particular predator behaved towards something it had already decided, through several long minutes of careful observation, looked exactly like prey. Male 12 did not announce his presence. He never did. That was, more than any single physical trait, the entire foundation of how he had survived this long at this altitude, where a wasted approach could cost more energy than a starving animal could afford to spend. He simply waited until the shifting light and awkward, exhausted movement of the strangest herd he had ever observed drew close enough to the edge of his outcrop. And then, with the specific, unhurried economy of a hunter who had done this 1,000 times before, he moved. Corporal Yes, positioned at the perimeter's northern edge, never fully registered what happened to him. One moment he was scanning the dark ridge above, rebreather laboring, weapon held at a ready position his exhausted arms were struggling to maintain. The next, something struck him from an angle his sensors had never flagged. A controlled, precise weight that hit low and drove him sideways off his feet before his suit's impact alarms had finished processing the contact. He was not badly hurt, a fact that would later strike Ravik as either remarkable luck or a deliberate, testing restraint on the part of whatever had hit him, though nothing in Threshold Fleet doctrine offered a framework for crediting an animal with restraint. But he was down, disoriented, and by the time he'd recovered enough to raise his weapon, whatever had struck him was already gone, vanished back into rock and shadow with a speed his suit's own thrusters would have struggled to match. Contact, Yes managed, scrambling upright. Something struck me from the ridge, it's gone. I don't have a clean reading. Ravik's own sensors, straining against both the thin air and terrain that scattered every scanning frequency his equipment relied on, returned nothing but static and a fading heat signature already dissolving into the general cold of the rock face. Description: fast, low, quiet. I never heard it coming, Commander. Across the perimeter, 2 more scouts reported similar disturbances within the next 10 minutes. Brief, glancing contacts that left equipment scraped and nerves considerably more frayed than any of Ravik's dozen previous campaigns had ever required. Nothing had been seriously damaged. Nobody had been seriously hurt. But something out there, moving with a confidence and precision his own exhausted, gasping soldiers could not begin to match, had clearly decided that his perimeter was not a defended line at all, but a loosely scattered collection of individually vulnerable targets. Ket, Ravik radioed back to the command ship, his voice tight with an effort that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with simply getting enough air into his lungs to speak clearly. I need updated wildlife threat assessments for this region. Immediately. There was a pause on the line longer than Ravik cared for. Checking the database now, Commander. One moment. Aboard the command ship, Ket pulled the full zoological profile on the species his sensors had flagged, cross-referenced it against every scrap of available data the Threshold Fleet Survey Division had gathered on this specific mountain range, and found, to his mounting discomfort, a profile built almost entirely from second-hand observation, decades-old field notes, and a general assumption, baked into the database by analysts who had never once had to test it personally, that a solitary, elusive predator posed minimal organized threat to a trained military unit. What the database had never properly accounted for was elevation. It had never accounted for the fact that Ravik's soldiers, gasping through thinning air and equipment never designed for it, were operating at a fraction of their normal capability, while the animal stalking them moved through that same air with the effortless, practiced ease of something whose entire physiology had spent tens of thousands of years adapting specifically to this exact altitude, this exact terrain, this exact cold. Commander, Ket said carefully, relaying the correction, the threat classification requires revision. The species is rated low aggression toward humans under normal observed conditions. However, our own personnel are currently operating at severely reduced capacity relative to typical baseline, while the local predator population is fully adapted to these exact conditions. I would recommend treating any further contact as a genuine tactical concern rather than a wildlife nuisance. Ravik crouched behind a low outcrop with his rebreather laboring and 2 more scouts reporting fresh scrapes from contacts nobody had actually seen coming, found he did not need the correction explained to him twice. Understood, he said. Titan formation. Nobody moves alone, and somebody find out if there is a way to make ourselves less appealing to whatever that is. There was not, as it turned out, a straightforward answer to that question anywhere in the Directorate's considerable combined body of military doctrine, because no previous campaign in 11,000 years of expansion had ever required one. By the time the first gray light of morning reached the valley, word of the strange lights on the ridge had already spread through Chundrathang the way news always spread in a village that size, faster than any official channel could have managed and considerably more accurately than most people expected, given how far the story had to travel by mouth alone. Namgyal had spent most of the night at the high overlook with his binoculars, watching, and by dawn he had a fairly clear picture of what had happened up on that ridge, or at least clear enough to draw the one conclusion that mattered most to him as both a tracker and a man who had spent a decade documenting exactly how Male 12 operated. "They've been hunted," he told Tenzin over the first tea of the morning in the flat, matter-of-fact tone he used for reporting any piece of mountain business. "At least twice in the night, from what I could see. Nobody down there is walking steady. Nobody's holding formation properly. That's not soldiers looking cautious. That's prey that already knows something's watching them." Tenzin, who had spent 3 years studying exactly this kind of predator behavior in a classroom several thousand kilometers and one very different life away from this valley, found herself looking at her own field notes with something between professional fascination and genuine, unshakable unease. If it's Male 12, he won't stop just testing them. Not once he's confirmed they're worth the effort. He'll commit properly once he understands the pattern. "He already understands the pattern," Namgyal said. "He's been watching this mountain his whole life. He doesn't need long to work out something new." Down in the village square, word had reached the district forestry officer, a young, harried man named Sonam Wangchuk who had, until approximately 6 hours ago, expected his most pressing concern that week to be a dispute over grazing rights near the lower pastures. He had made 3 separate calls on the one working line at the school, none of which had produced anything more useful than confused disbelief on the other end, and had finally settled, with the particular resignation of a man realizing that official channels were not going to arrive in time to matter, on doing the one thing that had always worked in this valley when something needed handling quickly. He asked Namgyal what he thought they should do. Namgyal's answer was, in its own way, exactly as pragmatic as anything Foreman Orlov might have offered from a very different, very distant platform 2 winters and one very different kind of cold away. "We do nothing," he said. "We stay well back, we keep the village clear of that ridge, and we let the mountain finish what it's already started. That is not cruelty. That is simply how this altitude has always settled its own disputes, long before we had a name for whoever is up there." "And if they come down toward the village?" Sonam asked. "Then it becomes our business, and we will handle it as our business. But I do not think they will. Whatever they came here to do, I do not believe they expected the mountain itself to argue back." He was, as it turned out, largely correct. Up on the ridge, Scout Leader Ravik's assessment of his own position had shifted considerably over the course of one long, exhausting, thoroughly humbling night, from securing a forward staging point to something closer to simple survival, an evaluation that arrived at almost exactly the same moment his commanding officer, watching from orbit, reached a similar and considerably more urgent conclusion of his own. "Status," High Commander Voss demanded, reviewing a set of overnight reports that bore almost no resemblance to the confident projections his own survey division had handed him 2 days earlier. "3 additional contacts overnight, Commander," Ket reported. "No fatalities, multiple minor injuries, equipment damage across roughly a third of the deployed unit. Morale reports are, to use the term our translation system selected, deteriorating rapidly." "By wildlife?" "By a single confirmed predator, Commander, operating with what our field team is now describing as deliberate, escalating tactical pressure. There may be additional individuals involved, but current data suggests we are dealing primarily with one highly capable animal exploiting our equipment's altitude limitations. Voss stared at the report for a long moment, turning over the particular, uncomfortable weight of an 11,000-year military tradition being systematically dismantled, overnight, by a single unbothered predator that had never received a single order, filed a single report, or shown the slightest interest in anything resembling a formal declaration of hostility. One animal. One animal, Commander, extremely well adapted to this specific terrain, and, according to Scout Leader Ravik's most recent transmission, apparently untroubled by our weapons' fire on the two occasions our forces attempted to engage it directly. The decision to hold position through a second night on the ridge was not, in retrospect, one that anyone aboard the command ship felt especially proud of, but withdrawal required daylight coordination that the previous night's chaos had made impossible to arrange cleanly, and so Ravik's exhausted, thoroughly rattled unit found itself facing a second full night of thin air, bitter cold, and an adversary that had, if anything, grown considerably more confident after its first several successful passes. Male 12 had, by that second evening, fully worked out the shape of the problem in front of him. In the specific, uncomplicated way, a predator worked out any new opportunity that presented itself on his mountain. These strange, loud things moved slowly. They tired quickly. They startled easily and reacted, when startled, with noise and light rather than any coordinated pursuit that could actually catch him on ground he knew infinitely better than they did. And there were, by his patient count, considerably more of them scattered across that shelf than any single kill required, which meant there was no particular urgency in how carefully he needed to choose his moments. He was not, it should be said, actually hunting them for food, a fact that would have surprised Ravik's own tactical analysts considerably less than it might have surprised a casual observer, had anyone thought to expo. Ain't it to them? Snow leopards did not, as a rule, view something outside their normal prey profile as an easy meal simply because it moved slowly. What male 12 was engaged in, across that second long night, was something closer to territorial enforcement, the same patient, repeated, escalating pressure he might have applied to a rival cat encroaching on his range, delivered with exactly enough force to make clear, without ever quite crossing into the kind of committed attack that would have ended things quickly, that this ground already belonged to something, and that something had no intention of sharing it. By midnight, Ravik had lost count of the individual contacts, each one brief, each one costing his unit another scrap of equipment, another dent in morale already worn thin by altitude and cold, and the specific, grinding exhaustion of an enemy they had still, after 2 full nights, never once managed to get a clean visual on. "Commander," Senek said, huddled behind what remained of their forward position, voice barely more than a whisper, "I do not think this animal intends to kill us." Ravik looked at him. "Explain." "It has had opportunities, Commander, multiple times. It has chosen, each time, simply to strike and withdraw. I believe it is not hunting us for survival. I believe it is telling us something." "And what precisely is it telling us?" Senek was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark, empty-looking rocks above them with the particular new wariness of a soldier who had learned, over 2 very long nights, exactly how little that emptiness actually meant. "I believe it is telling us to leave, Commander." Slowly and repeatedly, and with considerably more patience than I currently have the strength to appreciate. By the second morning, Namgyal had made a decision of his own, one that surprised even Tenzin, who had spent enough of her life around her grandfather to think she understood the shape of his caution reasonably well. "I am going up," he said, over breakfast, checking the straps on a pack he had not touched since the previous summer's camera trap circuit. "Grandfather, you said we stay back." "I said we let the mountain handle its own business, and it has. But whatever is left up there, whoever is left up there, They have been out in that cold for 2 full nights with no proper shelter and no real understanding of this terrain. That is no longer only the mountain's business. That is a matter of not letting something die of exposure 80 meters from ground I know how to survive on, whatever it came here to do. Tenzin recognized in the flat, settled certainty of his voice an argument she had heard him make before about lost trekkers, about stranded herders caught by early storms, about anyone at all who found themselves in trouble on ground Namgyal considered, in some fundamental sense, his responsibility to know well enough to help. Then I'm coming with you. I expected you would. They climbed through the thin, brutal cold of the morning with the practiced, economical pace of two people who had spent years learning exactly how to move at this altitude without wasting the oxygen a slower, more careful person might burn through panic alone, and reached the edge of the landing shelf a little before noon, to find a scene that neither of them, for all their preparation, was quite ready for. What remained of Ravik's assault wing was, by that point, less a military unit than a scattered collection of exhausted, thoroughly humbled soldiers, huddled in whatever cover the terrain offered, equipment scored and dented from 2 nights of contacts that had cost them nothing in actual casualties and everything in composure. Ravik himself, rebreather laboring, weapon held in hands too tired to keep entirely steady, watched the two figures approaching from below the ridge with the particular wariness of a commander who had, over the last 2 days, learned to distrust his own certainty about what this mountain might send at him next. "They're not aggressive," Namgyal said quietly to Tenzin, reading the posture of the group with the same practiced eye he'd have applied to any unfamiliar animal encountered on a trail. "Look at them. That's exhaustion, not threat." He raised both hands as he closed the last stretch of distance, the universal gesture he'd used a dozen times before with frightened trekkers, and once memorably, with a very confused foreign film crew who had wandered well past where their permits allowed. "We are not here to fight," he called out in careful, deliberate English, on the theory that whatever these things were, they had likely encountered that language somewhere along the way, and it was, at minimum, worth trying before anything else. Ravik's translator caught the words with a delay that felt, after 2 days of nothing but the growl of wind and the silent, sudden weight of an unseen predator, almost startlingly ordinary. "You are not associated with the CR. Eacher that has been attacking us." "No," Namgyal said, "but I know him, or her more likely, based on the pattern. This is not the first time something has come onto this mountain without understanding whose ground it already was." Ravik lowered his weapon slowly, an act that cost him more than he expected, given how long he had been holding it ready against a threat that had, until this exact moment, never once shown itself clearly enough to properly aim at. "You are saying this is territorial." "I am saying," Namgyal said, "that you landed in the middle of a snow leopard's range, at an altitude your people are clearly not built for, and it has spent 2 nights doing exactly what it does to anything else that wanders in uninvited. It has not tried to kill you. If it wanted you dead, you would already be dead. It is telling you to leave." What followed was, by any measure either species involved might have used to describe it, an entirely unprecedented diplomatic exchange, conducted between an exhausted alien scout commander 2 nights removed from any real sleep and an elderly Himalayan tracker who had, over the course of one very long morning, become the only person on that ridge who genuinely understood what had been happening to Ravik's unit since the moment they landed. "Your equipment," Namgyal said, examining the scored plating on the nearest soldier's shoulder with the same clinical interest he'd have given a set of fresh claw marks on a damaged camera trap, "was never built for this elevation. I don't need to understand your technology to see that. Your people are moving like men who cannot get enough air, because you cannot. Whatever conquered other places for you, it did not prepare you for 5,000 meters. Our scans indicated the terrain was survivable with standard equipment," Ravik said, and Namgyal heard, in the particular flatness of his translated voice, something that sounded remarkably close to the exhausted, humbled admission of a man who had learned an extremely expensive lesson in a very short window of time. "Your scans," Namgyal said, "looked at rock and cold and decided that was the whole story. They did not account for the air itself, and they certainly did not account for what already lives up here and has no interest in sharing it with anyone who arrives unprepared, whatever they intended to do once they arrived." Tenzin, standing a little apart, watching the exchange with the specific fascination of someone whose entire academic career had just collided, without warning, with something far larger than any research question she'd ever been trained to ask, found herself adding quietly, "He's not malicious. Male 12, I mean, if that's who this is. He's not driven by anything you'd recognize as cruelty. He's simply doing what every apex predator on this mountain has always done to anything that moves into his range without understanding the rules. You're not fighting an army. You're arguing with an ecosystem that has never once needed to negotiate before, because nothing has ever survived long enough up here to make negotiation necessary." Ravik sat with that for a long moment, the particular weight of it settling somewhere alongside every other humbling report he had already filed over the past 48 hours. "Then, what do you recommend?" "Leave," Namgyal said simply. "Get your people down off this ridge into thicker air, somewhere your equipment actually functions the way it was designed to. Whatever you came here to claim, it was never as empty as your scans told you it was, and I do not think it ever will be, no matter how many times you try." The Kelvex, or rather, the Threshold Fleet's own equivalent process, moving with considerably more caution than the previous night's chaos might have suggested, was still possible, arranged a full withdrawal over the course of that afternoon, ferrying exhausted soldiers back down toward the landing vessel in small, carefully spaced groups, on the theory, unspoken but universally understood among the surviving unit, that fewer stragglers meant fewer opportunities for whatever was still watching from the rocks above to make its point one final time. It made that point exactly once more, a single brief glancing contact against the last group to depart, delivered with what Ravik, reviewing the footage afterward, could only describe as an almost contemptuous economy of effort, as though the animal responsible had judged the entire remaining threat not worth the energy of a full committed strike. Nobody was seriously hurt. Nobody, by that point, particularly expected otherwise. Namgyal watched the final ascent back to the vessel from a safe distance, Tenzin beside him, both of them wrapped against a wind that had picked up again with the specific indifference this mountain always showed to anything happening on its slopes, human or otherwise. "Do you think they'll come back?" Tenzin asked. "Not here," Namgyal said, "not aft. Are this? Whoever writes their reports, wherever they write them, I think this mountain has already made its answer clear enough that they won't need to hear it twice." He watched the distant vessel's hatch seal, watched running lights flicker to life against the darkening sky. Whether they try somewhere else entirely, that is not for me to say. But this range, I think, will be left alone for a good long while. He was, as it turned out, entirely correct, though it would be some time before either of them learned exactly how correct, or how far the story of that particular ridge would eventually travel, in a report neither of them would ever personally read. The incident report that reached Threshold Fleet High Command 3 weeks later, compiled from Ravik's field account, Ket's logistics data, and a supplementary note High Commander Voss found himself drafting with considerably more care than he usually gave such documents, made for reading unlike almost anything else in the Directorate's considerable archive of conquest failures. Target region demonstrates no organized human military presence and negligible human population density across the majority of the terrain, the report read, in its formal opening section. However, this apparent vulnerability is offset entirely by two compounding factors our survey division failed to properly weight. First, the extreme elevation of this region degrades standard directorate equipment performance far beyond projected tolerances, reducing our force's effective combat capability to a fraction of baseline. Second, and more significantly, this terrain is not, in any meaningful sense, unclaimed. It is actively held by an apex predator species, fully adapted to conditions our own forces cannot reliably survive without substantial equipment modification. And this species demonstrated sustained, escalating, deliberately non-lethal tactical pressure against our forces over a period of 2 full nights, resulting in 0 fatalities but near-total operational collapse. Ravik, reviewing the draft before it was sent upward, added a final section of his own, in language considerably less formal than the rest of the document, but no less carefully considered. I do not believe this animal was ever attempting to kill us. I believe, based on the consistent restraint shown across every documented contact, that it was communicating something closer to a boundary, delivered with a patience and precision that our own doctrine has no real framework for crediting to a non-sapient species. Whether or not that assessment holds up to further study, I would strongly recommend against any future attempt to claim this terrain without first accounting for exactly what already lives there, and how completely unwilling it is to share it. High Command read the report, cross-referenced it against a growing, uncomfortable pile of similarly humbling files from unrelated regions of the same planet, and quietly added this particular mountain range to a list that was, by that point, becoming considerably longer than anyone back at the survey division felt entirely comfortable explaining. Life in Chundrathang returned to its own rhythm within days, the way life in a village that had survived considerably harsher and stranger things than a 2-night alien encampment tended to do, absorbed and folded quietly into the ordinary business of goats and grazing rights, and the long, patient work of getting through another season at altitude. Namgyal logged the whole thing in his own field notes, the same battered notebook he'd used for a decade to track Male 12's movements across the range, under an entry that simply read, in his careful, economical handwriting, "Unusual visitors, territory defended, no injuries to local wildlife confirmed." He never did report the full story to the district office in any official capacity, beyond what Sonam Wangchuk had already relayed upward on his own initiative, mostly because Namgyal had learned, over 61 years on this mountain, that some things went smoother when you didn't invite official explanation. Tenzin, back in Delhi the following semester, found herself rewriting an entire section of her thesis proposal around a single, quietly reframed question that her advisors found considerably more interesting than she initially expected. What happens to territorial predator behavior when an entirely novel, unfamiliar intruder enters a range the animal has never had reason to categorize before? She never mentioned, in any of the formal drafts, exactly what had prompted the question, and nobody who read it ever thought to ask. Male 12 himself was photographed again 11 days later, by one of the same camera traps Tenzin had helped set the previous month, moving unhurried and entirely unremarkable across a familiar stretch of ridge, utterly indifferent, as far as any image could tell, to the fact that he had, over the course of 2 long nights, single-handedly convinced an interstellar invasion force that this particular mountain was simply not worth the trouble. And somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, in an archive few would ever access again, a single entry remained permanently filed under a heading that Ket had drafted himself, in the dry, careful language of a man who had learned, over one very long deployment, exactly how much respect this planet's emptiest-looking places actually deserved. Region flagged for indefinite avoidance. Primary threat identified. Apex predator, solitary, territorial, fully adapted to conditions our forces cannot survive. Secondary note, the mountain was never empty. It only looked that way from orbit. In the months that followed, Ravik found himself reassigned to a considerably less demanding sector of the Directorate's expanding frontier, a transfer he suspected owed less to any failure on his part, and more to a quiet, unspoken understanding among his superiors that a commander who had personally been outmaneuvered by a single unarmed predator was not, strictly speaking, the kind of story high command wanted circulating too widely among newer officers. He did not resent the reassignment. If anything, he found a certain relief in it, a chance to serve somewhere the ground stayed where it was put and the air, at minimum, arrived in quantities his lungs could actually make use of. He thought about that mountain often, in the quiet hours between deployments, turning over the particular, uncomfortable lesson it had taught him in a way none of his previous campaigns ever had. 11 worlds conquered before this one, and every single one of them had yielded, eventually, to the simple, brute application of overwhelming force, properly applied, patiently escalated, until whatever resistance existed on the ground either surrendered or was removed. This mountain had offered no formal resistance at all. No army, no fortification, no voice raised in anger or negotiation. It had simply, calmly, patiently made clear, through 2 long nights of quiet, deliberate pressure, that the ground his forces stood on already belonged to something else, and that ownership was not up for discussion, no matter how advanced the weapons brought to argue against it. He wrote in a private log he never expected anyone else to read, a line that captured the thought as closely as his own translated language allowed. We have spent 11,000 years learning how to conquer things that fight back with weapons. We have never once needed to learn how to argue with something that simply refuses to acknowledge we were ever a threat worth taking seriously. I am not certain our doctrine has a category for that kind of defeat. I am beginning to suspect it should. 9 months later, long after the story of the ridge had faded from anything resembling active concern in either the village or, presumably, wherever reports of this kind eventually settled among the Directorate's considerable archives, Tenzin returned to Chundrathang for the summer field season, camera-trap memory cards in hand, ready to continue the slow, patient work of documenting male 12's range across another year of seasons. Among the thousands of ordinary images that season produced, mule deer, blue sheep, the occasional blurred, half-formed shape of the old ghost himself moving unhurried through fresh snow, there was exactly one frame that made her stop scrolling entirely, sitting very still at her grandfather's kitchen table with the laptop screen glowing in front of her. It was nothing dramatic, a single still image, timestamped from the second night of the encounter, triggered by motion the camera had dutifully recorded without any understanding of what it was actually looking at. In the frame, barely visible at the edge of the flash's reach, was the unmistakable low, coiled silhouette of a snow leopard mid-stride, moving with the same patient, unhurried economy that had defined every documented moment of his long life on that mountain, entirely unbothered by the strange, glowing wreckage of a vessel visible in the far background, already beginning its retreat. She showed the image to her grandfather without a word. Namgyal studied it for a long moment, the particular stillness of a man reading something he already understood settling over his face, and then, finally, allowed himself something close to a smile. "There," he said, "that is the only report that mountain will ever need to file. Everything else is just paperwork. If you made it all the way up to this ridge with me, drop a comment and tell me whether you'd have had the nerve to climb up there like Namgyal did. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more of Earth's wildest places refusing to be conquered, and share this with somebody who needs to hear what happens when you invade a mountain without asking who already lives there. See you in the next one.